If I was going to go back in time and I was going to look at any of these agents in an off-season context from the most like tolerable, safe, benign, but still effective compound that I'd be using, I'd be doing something like an What's up guys, Derek from PlaySmart8s.com. Today we're going to be talking about pre-workout androgens and oral steroids in general. So something you probably, got passed down the grapevine through the bro forums back in the day, or just your gym buddies or whatever it is kick-starting steroids with anabolics that are orally administered. Dianabol kickstart for 6 weeks, or, Anadrol, or fucking whatever, different compounds that are fast acting to get a fast influx of progress in while your long esters kick in, because we all know long esters aren't actually working until week 6 to 8, which is fucking stupid. Obviously they're working nearly immediately. Like, to think that they have, just because you haven't reached steady state until 5 half-lives, to think that the drug is not doing anything, just absolutely fucking mind-blowingly stupid. But anyways, the pharmacokinetics of these oral steroids, like, they're so fast absorbing, they spike in serum concentration so aggressively, you can actually get pre-workout acute effects around your window of training by leveraging them. Pre-workout guys are using things like Anadrol, pre-workout, to get actual instantaneous changes in motor unit recruitment, in aggression, etc. in the gym, and it seems to work. However, is this the optimal way to do it, and is it sustainable given the fact that when you're using it on a daily basis, the significant hepatotoxicity will eventually accumulate and likely will fuck up your appetite, prevent you from eating enough in an off season, basically be counterproductive in the majority of the year when you're actually trying to gain size and gain strength, relative to when you're in contest prep and it's a little bit different. You're just trying to retain, and you're trying to offset, muscle protein degradation, etc., and just approach things from an anti-catabolic context more so than a real protein accretion aspect in a surplus. So again, when the fuck would you use orals then? A lot of guys have pretty much abandoned them in the off season entirely because they're ultimately pretty counterproductive for most people. When they kill your appetite, they spike liver toxicity. They're not a primary driver of hypertrophy via agonism of the androgen receptor. In fact, many of these oral anabolic agents have fucking undetectable binding affinity for androgen receptors. So why would that be the thing you are using as your main vector of addressing muscle protein synthesis? It wouldn't be. So why the fuck would you use them in the first place? Well, it would be to leverage their acute effects peri-workout, ideally. Again, and that circles back to why guys are using things like Anadrol pre-workout, why powerlifters love things like Anadrol and Halo test and shit like that, is leveraged in a acute strength, neurological recruitment aspect to get disproportionate amounts of strength relative to what you could otherwise with a very base, profile of, a basic testosterone plus nandrolone or something potentially. So again, what do I think in terms of pre-workout androgens at this point, and oral agents in general? Something I've learned over the years is the pharmacokinetics of these drugs through different administration techniques. And this was basically something I learned indirectly by accident when I was evaluating the pharmacokinetic profile of oral estradiol in unison with DECA, because nandrolone monotherapy at certain dosages may not provide enough estrogen receptor activation to provide neuroprotection, to provide cardioprotection, and we see neurodegenerative outcomes in monotherapy cases in the clinical literature. And this is why when you use things like growth hormone concurrently with it, all of a sudden neuroprotection, goes up significantly. Estradiol concentrations may increase disproportionately. You see improvements in neurological health when you can combine things that are substrates for aromatase and or increase estrogen receptor activation / aromatization amounts. So anyways, I was, looking at estradiol exogenously to use with a monotherapy like TRT dose essentially of nandrolone during an experiment I was running a while ago, many years ago. Not many, it was a fucking couple of years ago at this point. And I was discovering how not favorable oral estradiol is. And this is partly due to its lack of bioavailability, but in addition to that, the interaction in the liver itself and the disproportionate spike in metabolites it creates during first pass. So again, pharmacokinetics of estradiol is what we're going to be using as an extrapolation to kind of apply to a more optimal way to apply pre-workout androgens, potentially, in my opinion. This would be how I would leverage shit if I was to go back in time and do the whole look at things like Anabol, Anadrol, Anavar, etc. again. So when you look at different administration techniques of estradiol, and we will be looking at the pharmacokinetics of Anabol, Anavar, halotestin, Winstrol, etc. shortly, so just bear with me while I explain this. Basically, what happens when you take this shit orally is you get a very, very shitty response from the parent compound, unfortunately. Like you see here, this table that evaluates different administration routes and the difference in parent compound spiked in the serum relative to the metabolite. So here we have the oral route of administration, and you see estradiol levels only go up to 25 picograms per milliliter after our 1 milligram concentration is administered, but estrone levels go to fucking 150. So you have an E2 to E1 ratio of 0.15, which is not physiological whatsoever, but yet, this is, the most preferred method of administration because it's the easiest. You just pop a pill and that's it. However, what a lot of people don't realize is you take the exact same fucking pill and you take it sublingually. Look what happens to the ratio of hormones in the blood. You have 450 picograms per milliliter from the same 1 milligram of estradiol relative to 160 picograms per milliliter of estrone. So you have almost the exact same estrone concentration as you had in oral, despite the fact that you were literally not mainlining it, but you're introducing it far more directly into your bloodstream by somewhat effectively skipping first pass metabolism. And here we get a fucking, look how much higher of a spike in E2 we get from sublingual when you're holding it under your tongue and you're administering it in a way that it is absorbing right into the mucosal membrane of your fucking mouth, essentially. Now, if you guys have ever heard of like boofing alcohol, have you ever heard of like those psychopath fucking college students who would soak tampons in alcohol and like shove it up their ass and get super fucking drunk without even drinking? That's another method of administration. I'm not recommending it, but it's an example of how these things can get right into the blood by skipping first pass and getting a disproportionate spike in parent compound relative to metabolite. So again, not only is this leverage to get around drug testing, and again, if you circle back to the Duchess cocktail, if you haven't seen my video on the Duchess cocktail used by Rod Shankov to get around drug testing using a combination of, I believe it was oral trenbolone, oral metenolone perhaps, Turinabol used to be used and then it was phased out, I believe. I forget what the combination was exactly, but I broke it down in that video. But you'll note that they swished this mixture around their mouth, but did not swallow it directly. It was not meant to be just like slammed like a fucking, oral pill of Anabol or something. Rather, they were trying to absorb it into the mucosal membrane of the lining of their mouth to get it right into the bloodstream as quickly as possible and get an acute aggressive spike in blood serum concentrations and get it in and out of their system as quickly as possible, but also get a disproportionate spike in performance outcomes that should otherwise exceed what you would get if you just took it orally and let it go through first pass metabolism. So again, sublingual, for not all intensive purposes, but it actually very closely reflects the pharmacokinetic profile of literally IVing a drug right into your fucking vein. So again, if we were going to compare, let's just say Anabol, and we're going to take it orally, swallow it, you end up with a half-life of whatever it was, like 4 to 6 hours, I believe. I'll have to go look at the, let's see, I have stanozolol here, metandianone. So the half-life is 3 to 6 hours. But you also have to keep in mind the 5-alpha reduction to, the methyl testosterone conversion here. Methyl 1 testosterone and the, methyl estradiol aromatization, and whatever other metabolites come as a result of breakdown in the liver. This kind of shit is going to result in, a longer half-life and a less acute performance outcome around your workout window. So again, you're having longer bouts of liver toxicity, longer bouts of stress on organ systems, perhaps not as advantageous of a performance outcome, not as aggressive of a performance outcome, because you are basically like bleeding out the fucking compound in a perhaps suboptimal administration fashion. So again, circling back to the estradiol, we see the pharmacokinetics of Let's see, like intramuscular injection, we see a 2.7 ratio of estradiol to estrone. Here we see the 3 estradiol to estrone ratio of sublingual. And topical, we have a 1-to-1 here. Rectal, we have a 5-to-1. But so what's the most like realistic to adhere to and is still going to produce like disproportionately favorable outcomes where you have the parent compound remaining mostly intact, getting into the bloodstream extremely fucking efficiently and quickly and aggressively, perhaps spiking performance outcomes to a level that is unachievable even with normal oral administration, and ensuring the majority of that compound retains its parent structure rather than gets converted into all these random fucking metabolites. Like if you recall correctly, or if I recall correctly, oxymethylone Anadrol, I made a video about like the dark horse steroid Anadrol. Editor hopefully finds a card to that. That was where one of the videos I explored the potential of sublingual Anadrol administration. And you'll find that the, what the fuck was the byproduct compound that it creates through first pass metabolism? I don't remember. It wasn't, what, mistanolone perhaps? Anyways, when these drugs go through, get detoxified and whatnot, and they start getting broken down into different kinds of agents, those have their own inherent anabolic to androgenic ratios. They have their own inherent agonism of different receptors in the body, different antagonism of glucocorticoid receptors, different agonism of androgen receptor, etc. They're basically creating their own steroids as a result of going through first pass. Now, is this something you can entirely avert by doing sublingual or injection or rectal or whatever? No, but you can disproportionately leverage a more advantageous ratio for predicting what you're trying to get out of it. So if you're trying to retain the base structure of the compound and basically get what the drug was designed to do from its parent, like molecular activity, and get it in and out of your system way faster, which is like the primary objective of doing it in this context too, not only to retain the majority of its structure in a more favorable ratio of parent relative to metabolite, but in addition to that, because again, sometimes the metabolites may actually be the reason why it works so well. In the case of Anadrol, is that why it works in an aggression, acute, like neurological adaptation context so well as the fucking mistanolone rather than the Anadrol itself? That remains to be seen, but this is where we're going to be getting into Anavar shortly, and its metabolism mainly through the liver or the kidneys rather through the liver, and how we can perhaps leverage this in a more advantageous way that is not impactful to hepatotoxicity, nephrotoxicity too significantly, and can otherwise get very, very significant performance enhancing effects in and out of the system aggressively in a way that might make it more effective and less stressful on organ systems, and get you back to a baseline homeostatic set point where you have no kind of inhibition of, appetite or anything like that. So again, circling back to the estrogen administration, we can see the most viable route of administration that is going to get it in it. Now again, the reason you would be taking estradiol is presumably for like hormone replacement or something. This is something you'd want like in your system at all times. That's not why we'd be using oral anabolic agents. I'm just using this as an example of the pharmacokinetics and how you can leverage them accordingly to get your drug to do different shit than you otherwise are forced to it doing if you're taking it just orally. So again, we see the ratio being significantly more favorable from a sublingual context. You're essentially replicating what may be reflective of intravenous administration only by having to administer it under your tongue and hold it there. So obviously a more viable and more easy to adhere to thing. Like, are you ever going to fucking mainline Anadrol or Anavar or D-ball into your vein? No, you're not, hopefully. I can't even imagine how toxic that would be too, depending on like what it's suspended in and shit like that. Fucking brutal, dude. If you have like a sublingual troche though, or a pill or whatever it is that can otherwise absorb through the mucosal membrane fairly easily, now we're on to something potentially. So anyways, let's look at some of the pharmacokinetic graphs here of oral estradiol, for example. You can see here in time, hours, as well as estradiol concentrations. Here we have 2 milligrams, 4 milligrams, and 8 milligrams. And we see this spike in estradiol going from 2 milligrams of oral. We get up to like 30 picograms per milliliter at 3 hours in. And we have this little tiny fucking like barely male HRT levels up until, a couple days later where we start to dip into like hypogonadism territory. And this is This is in the context of premenopausal women. Like what these are levels reflective of like a natural male at 2 milligrams a day. So keep in mind, like you're probably familiar with, 20 to 40 picogram per milliliter levels. You probably see this shit in your blood work all the time. You use 4 milligrams a day and boom, you get up to close to you get 140 upwards at the spike. And then down there, you start to dip out by the 48-hour mark. But are these like very significant spikes and very acute aggressive spikes? Not really. These really like bleed, like you could argue these are by the, acute exposure of these big dosages, but you're really getting like a bleed out effect and not that big of a spike considering the overall drug burden. However, when you use these same dosages buccally or sublingually, now buccal is another way you can get this to absorb through the mucosal membrane. Ultimately, I think sublingual is the easiest one to explain, but both are viable options. But here we see sublingual pharmacokinetics, and look at this shit. Remember that 2 milligrams barely produced a 30. Now, in the same picogram per milliliter concentrations, we have less than half that dose. Less than half that dose, we can see 1 milligram orally. You're barely fucking moving the needle, dude. You're like up to 25 picograms per milliliter at peak. However, 1 milligram of sublingual, look at this shit, bro. Look at this shit. You're getting up to 450. And look at this window here. You see this giant fucking spike and then this giant crash, all within the span of a handful of hours. And yeah, it's gonna bleed out of your system fairly slowly, but you don't need this much drug. Again, if you have 0.25 milligrams, you can actually get away with less drug burden, get it in and out of your system more aggressively, get a more aggressive performance enhancing vector out of it because it's in and out of your system so aggressively. Like you're spiking it in your system way faster, but also getting it out of your system way faster. You can see how this might have some translation to oral anabolics as I'm sort of like displaying the difference in pharmacokinetics here. So we can either have this, a big fucking dose to get a suboptimal parent compound elevation here that lasts for days, or we can get a much lower dosage, but get it in and out of your system so fucking fast and aggressively that it produces a far more significant pharmacologic effect that you're trying to get out of it. Now again, for E2, this isn't necessarily ideal. Again, like this is in a HRT context for fucking women in menopause. We're talking about anabolics for a peri-workout scenario. We're trying to not suppress our appetite. We're trying to not do things that are going to hinder organ systems. We're trying to leverage them around the workout ideally to actually get what you're trying to get out of these oral agents, which should be, in my opinion, acute neurological changes and adaptations in the gym, because I don't think these should be the primary drivers of hypertrophy or protein accretion. I think you should be relying on your injectables for driving actual muscle protein synthesis and agonism of the androgen receptor, because in general, they're actually far more potent at agonizing the androgen receptor. Things like oxymethylone have undetectable binding affinity. Now again, do their metabolites like mestanolone have significant binding affinity and agonism of certain receptors that are more useful in that context? I don't know, but ultimately you don't want to be relying on those for your muscle growth. Because again, these are not safe for your organs. Not that fucking injectables are safe like tastanandrolone, but again, obviously if you're going to be relying on a fucking steady state of Anadrol versus a steady state of like nandrolone, like which one do you think is going to be more tolerable long term for actually relying on muscle growth? Obviously the injectable agents that are more tried and true rather than something that's significantly hepatotoxic, nephrotoxic, and has unpredictable affinity or unpredictable activity and is like prevents you from fucking eating, for example. So anyways, when you get into the oral anabolic agents, they mostly have higher bioavailability because of their 17 alpha alkylation, and they have different, their half-lives in general are around like 8 hours, like stanozolol, winstrol, 9 hours apparently. Now we have halotestin, which has a half-life of 9.2 hours, pretty similar. We have D-bol, which has a shorter half-life, 3 to 6 hours, but paradoxically, it's not that much more effective in a pre-workout context than things like Anadrol or Anavar. Oxymethylone, interestingly enough, one of the most used anabolic agents in a clinical setting, orally, unknown half-life, kind of fucking weird. Any site that tells you it knows what the half-life of Anadrol is fucking lying. Nobody actually knows. So we don't know. But anyways, we know it's well absorbed. And we know it's been used in a clinical setting at really pretty fucking substantial dosages comparable to that of what people are using it in a pre-workout context. Now, most notably that I wanted to touch on is Anavar. It has a half-life of 9 to 10 hours approximately, but it's primarily metabolized through kidneys rather than the liver. So it's less hepatotoxic than these other anabolic agents. It's pretty fucking effective at driving strength and neurological adaptations, and I think it gets a bad rap as a female drug, when in reality, in men, it's still pretty fucking potent at doing what it does. It's not going to, again, is it going to make you huge? No, but again, this shouldn't be the reason you use oral agents anyways. Things that bloat you up like fucking D-bol. Are you getting huge from D-bol necessarily, or is it the nandrolone you're using with the D-bol? Like again, these things are going to be used complementary in a way that helps drive training adaptations acutely, in my opinion, is the main way these things can be leveraged in a useful context, or, obviously in a pre-contest scenario to drive, temporary changes in, fluid dynamics and whatnot, try and get more intramuscular fullness and shit, get more blood volume, stuff like that, like if you're trying to use Anadrol loading into a show, totally irrelevant to what we're talking about right now. We're talking about in a off-season context when you're trying to gain maximal amounts of strength and size whilst being as safe as possible. So again, I think oxandrolone gets a really bad rap just because females use it at pretty low dosages, and it's been seen as a women's drug, when in reality it's pretty good at what it does, and it's pretty innocuous in comparison to things like Anadrol, which have been shown like it's a fucking known carcinogen. Like, is Anavar going to be as bad on your liver as Anadrol? No, not at all. And there's, as far as I know in the literature, no evidence supporting that it can cause, literal liver cancer, which Anadrol can. Things like Anabolic, are these things going to be way more hepatotoxic than Anavar? Yes, in my opinion. So again, circling back to the estradiol pharmacokinetics and how this applies to everything, I think, given the fact that they have relatively long half-lives, if you're working out, let's just say, first of all, if you're working out, let's just say 5 days a week, you have 2 days off. Does it make a lot of sense to be using Anadrol on your off days if your primary modality of driving muscle protein synthesis is through your injectable agents? Probably not. And again, if you're going to be putting stress on your liver and shit and killing your appetite, does it make sense to be using Anadrol on your off days anyways? No, I think you're just getting cumulative exposure that is unnecessary and is going to be counterproductive and ultimately make it less useful to use orals whatsoever. However, if you're leveraging this stuff just on days you actually really need it, let's just say a heavy fucking leg day or a heavy back day or whatever it is, does it make more sense to use something, in a pre-workout window? Maybe, using something like this a couple times a week, a few times a week at most, makes a bit more sense. This is something you would be able to sustainably use for more weeks because you're not using it every day, especially on days you're not even fucking training. You're going to be redlining your sympathetic nervous system far less. You're not going to be putting unnecessary stress on organ systems. You're not going to be relying on these for your primary vector of hypertrophy anyways. You're using these for training adaptations, ideally in an acute window. So again, let's just say we're using it, a couple times a week, a few times a week when we actually need it, and it makes sense. That's the first thing that can be useful for actually dragging out the utility of these things long-term throughout a full off-season or the majority of an off-season, whilst not killing appetite, hopefully, and actually using it when it's useful. But again, we're still dealing with a pretty long half-life here. So again, if we're using Anavar, for example, and let's just say for hypothetical, all intensive purposes, the Anadrol half-life is similar to the rest of the half-lives, which are, other than D-bol, like around 8, 9, 10 hours. Let's just say Anadrol is also 9 hours or something. I'm not saying it is, I'm just saying for all intents and purposes. So when we use this shit, keep in mind, it takes 5 half-lives for a compound to clear out of your system enough that it's no longer, in some contexts, suppressive, problematic, having significant pharmacologic activity that it's otherwise seen as active in your system. So if it takes 5 half-lives for, serum concentrations to spike, as well as full clearance, we're looking at a compound that is ultimately going to be in your system for fucking 50 hours before you get full clearance. So again, are you really getting the shit in and out of your system to a point that it's not stressing you out unnecessarily on days that you're not even needing it potentially, when it has a 50-hour clearance time? If we take Anadrol 3 times a week, is it actually just pre-workout and it's around the workout window, or is it dragging into the days, perhaps not suppressing appetite as badly as it could or being as fucking liver toxic as it could be? It's still there though. in a less than ideal way. So what if we could get this elimination half-life down though significantly, and not only get the elimination half-life down significantly, but in addition to that, disproportionately aggressively spike serum concentrations of the parent hormone, so we get it before the workout, spike not to just, what is reflective, let's just say, like 30 picograms per milliliter for a dose, but that same dose that could only produce 30 picograms in your fucking blood becomes 450 or whatever the fuck it was that's reflective of estradiol. I'm not saying that's what the levels would be, but I'm just trying to say as an example, when you're comparing the pharmacokinetics, like that's the disparity in this shit. When you have 1 milligram of estradiol orally, we get a little negligible 25 picogram increase versus 1 milligram sublingual. Boom, we're getting up to fucking 450. So imagine if we can reflect, now again, the oral bioavailability of these 17 alpha alkylated agents is not as bad as estradiol, where you're going to get this reflective activity. However, we can still leverage getting it into your blood without having to deal with first pass metabolism far more aggressively, get it spiked serum concentrations far more aggressively, perhaps yield a more aggressive pharmacologic effect out of it in a strength context, and then get it out of your system much faster. If we're getting it directly mainlined into your system, not actually, but what is the most closely reflective version of that in a pharmacokinetic profile, and is actually something you can adhere to, because like, again, who's going to mainline Anadrol into their vein 3 times a week? Nobody. Well, maybe some people, but most people are not, and it's probably not the safest thing to be doing, suspended in fucking toxic carrier oils and shit. If we can use like a sublingual administration of a oxymethylone, or ideally something that is more benign but still potent like an oxandrolone, we can get it in and out of our system really aggressively, get a more significant effect in a pre-workout context, get in and out of our system to a point that it's not significantly, suppressing appetite, around the clock, or causing any kind of hindrance to, GI distress or any of the shit. Because again, skipping the fucking majority of, like, again, you're not totally averting the fact that you're gonna swallow some of this shit, obviously, but you are skipping first pass to a fairly significant extent where you can otherwise leverage a far more potentially favorable pharmacokinetic profile in the acute peri-workout setting. So that is what I'm proposing here. Something I've been toying around with for years at this point, not like literally, but the idea of it, and it seems to play out pretty well. A lot of individuals have started experimenting with this method of administration, and it seems logical in my eyes as to why this may work and why it may be the only viable way to administer oral steroids in an off-season context. Because again, are you going to be relying on your D-ball kickstart to be the driver of hypertrophy? Like, hopefully fucking not, bro. Like, I hope your 6-week Dianabol use is not what you're trying to achieve your muscle protein synthesis outcomes with. I hope you'd be using these things in an acute peri-workout window setting and actually allow yourself to get away with doing it without significant amounts of liver stress by being more reserved with using it when it actually makes sense, and you can actually take advantage of the acute performance outcomes that you can get from such a short active life compound. So my thing that I'm thinking is, if I was going to go back in time and I was going to look at any of these agents in an off-season context from the most like tolerable, safe, benign, but still fucking effective compound that I'd be using, I'd be doing something like an Anavar sublingual a couple times a week, maybe a few times a week. I think that makes a lot of sense. I think, and you can get away with a much lower dosage because you're getting it aggressively spiked in your blood serum concentrations, far more acutely spiking and crashing in and out of your system far more aggressively, getting it out so it's not, suppressing other things in your body and suppressing other things like appetite throughout the week. Not that Anavar necessarily does that potently anyways, but again, this should hypothetically apply to things like oxymethylone, pending that the metabolites are not the driver of all of its effects. Dianabol, Halo maybe. I think it depends on how potent and pharmacologically active the metabolites are that are produced in the quantities during first pass as to how effective this will be for each respective compound. But ultimately, this is a very unexplored vector of performance that I think is definitely worth evaluating more thoroughly, and maybe a safer way and more effective way potentially to apply these oral agents. So let me know what you guys think in the comments down below. Do you have any experience with sublingual administration of orals? Have you ever done them in a, like intermittent window, or you're using them just in a pre-workout context a couple times a week rather than doing a 6-week fucking burst of this shit where you are, basically stressing yourself potentially unnecessarily, for weeks on end, just because, that's what the bro lore passed down the grapevine has told us, that you need to be using orals for 6 weeks straight and then take 6 weeks off and then go 6 weeks on and blah, blah, blah. Let me know. All the comments help the algorithm. Hopefully it gave you something interesting to think about. I think this is a thing that is going to be more and more popular over the years. So anyways, check it out, as well as my original oxymethylone video. I think that is definitely a useful breakdown of it as well. Specifically diving into the Anadrol administration rather than this was more so a focus on Anavar. You can check that out, as well as anything else. Well, I'm actually not plugging anything. I'm talking about a video that should be in the cards. If you want to support the channel, you can check out anything I'm associated with in the video description below. My TRT clinic, it's all telemedicine from the comfort of your own home. Get high quality medical oversight from doctors who understand what kind of diagnostics you should be getting, regardless if you're a natural or a guy who's enhanced or a guy on HRT, whatever it is. We are non-judgmental and we provide high quality medical oversight for all individuals, and we'll provide the education behind the diagnostics, and that's what we pride ourselves in. Rather than being a cookie cutter testosterone mill, we pride ourselves in the high quality services and consultation services that we provide our clients. And regardless if you're natural or a massive fucking bodybuilder, we do it all. We're turnkey. We look at everything from hematology to metabolic parameters to liver health to fucking thyroid to endocrine. It's all covered, and that's why we are setting ourselves apart in this industry, in my opinion. And we don't just focus on trying to maximize the markups on medications. We focus on making, like, our lucrative portion of this business is the niched out shit that we do, like Dutch testing, genetic analysis, interpretations, the recommendations based on lifestyle, dietary intervention things. All this stuff is based upon our high quality interpretation of diagnostics and ability to make recommendations that no one else can really parse out, because how many people are staying up to date in the most current literature? Not very many clinics. Most of them are just giving out cookie cutter scripts of test, HCG, and anastrozole still. So anyways, if you want a high quality doctor, it's fucking critical that you do so. Even staying on top of the literature of like angiotensin receptor blockade, shit like that, beta blockers, like who's fucking doing it? Not very many, unfortunately. So it's very critical that you get a high quality doctor that is in your camp to keep you as safe as possible. Regardless if you're natural or enhanced, you can check it out in the video description below, as well as anything else I'm associated with: Gorilla Mind, nootropic formulas, Gorilla Mode, pre-workout formulas. I designed myself from scratch. I'm going to recommend a diet model for maximum strength and muscle growth, whilst being mindful of micronutrient intake, health, gut health, sleep hygiene, electrolyte intake, thyroid health, a lot of shit that goes overlooked by common cookie cutter influencer diets. Sold on Instagram. You can check it out in the video description below, as well as the clothing company that sponsors me and anything else I'm associated with. It is all in the video description below. Thank you guys for watching. Talk to you soon.